Good morning, fourth grade. We're going to go ahead and get started on chapter 10. I know we're kind of used to working out of our book, but we're actually going to head back into it for this first section. All right, so we are on, I forget what page you're on because I don't have my book with me. I'm actually working on paper, but it's section 10. So go ahead and head there, and we're going to go ahead and get started. Throughout this video, I'm going to ask you to pause a couple times, so just make sure you're listening for when I say that. So here we go. It says, Khalil and Mara were working on their math homework. Mara wrote 4/5 as 1/5 plus 1/5 plus 1/5 plus 1/5. Khalil looked at Mara's work and said, I think you could use multiplication to rewrite your equation. Is Khalil's observation correct? Explain. So what I want you to do is pause for a moment, work on this, and then once you're done, go ahead and hit play on the video. Alright, so if you take a look, here is Mara's work. She wrote out some fraction strips like this, and then she also wrote it as a addition sentence and has her answer over here. Now, if you remember, what is multiplication? Multiplication is repeated addition of the same number. If you take a look here, isn't this repeated addition of the same number? Yes. So multiplication is repeated addition. So Khalil is correct. You could rewrite this as a multiplication sentence instead of a long addition sentence. But how would we do that? Let's take a look down here. What is an equation that we could use to show what Mara did, but with multiplication instead, like Khalil suggested? So go ahead, pause, see if you can come up with an equation that will show what they both did, kind of like their combined work together. So here's what Mara had. She had 1/5 plus 1/5 plus 1/5 plus 1/5 equals 4/5. We know that when we add fractions, the bottom number stays the same, and we add the numerator. So this stays as 5, and we add these together and get 4/5. So this is Mara, and that is correct. But what Khalil was suggesting was this. We have multiplication instead. I could rewrite this as 4 times 1/5 and get 4/5. They are both correct. So as we move forward, we're going to start multiplying fractions and whole numbers. So if you could flip to your next page, I'm just going to flip mine over just like that and go right here. And we're going to talk about something called a unit fraction. What is a unit fraction? It kind of describes part of a fraction or part of a whole. So if you take a look here, it says Courtney ran 3/4 of the way to school. Describe 3/4 using unit fractions. So we're going to take a look. Do you remember when we decomposed fractions? We wrote it as kind of an addition sentence that made up that fraction. We're going to do the same thing. But this time we're going to break it down as much as possible. Now when we have a unit fraction, I'm going to direct your attention to this bubble here. Unit fractions always contain the numerator 1. So whenever we have a unit fraction, 1 will always be in the numerator. So if I look down here, okay, it says when a whole is divided into 4 equal parts, each part is described as 1/4. We know that. So those 3 of those parts are described as 3/4. So if I have 1/4, 1/4, and 1/4, that adds up or can be multiplied to make 3/4. All right, and if I take a look over here, 3 1/4 parts make 3/4. So I can add them up just like Mara did, or I can multiply them like Khalil did. So if I take 3 times 1/4, that gives me 3/4. Now you'll notice when I multiply 3 times 1/4, which number does 3 multiply by? 3 multiplies by the 1, multiplies by the numerator, and again, the denominator stays the same. We're going to get more into why that happens tomorrow, but for right now, just remember your whole number only multiplies by the numerator. Keep that in mind. Always multiplies by the numerator. So I'm going to head down here and take a look at these guys. It says, so we're looking at 5/8 right now. What number in 5/8 tells you how many equal parts are in one whole? What number tells you how many equal parts are described? How many 1/8 parts are there in 5/8? Okay, that's a little bit wordy. Let me break this down a little bit and maybe we can understand a bit better. So what number in 5/8 tells you how many equal parts are in one whole? What that's asking is, if I drew one whole, so let's say I drew a rectangle. If I drew a rectangle just like that, how do I know how many pieces to break that up into? What number in 5/8 tells me, hey, break it up this many times? Well, that's always the denominator. So the denominator tells you how many pieces to break the whole up into. How many pieces to break up whole into. Okay, so the denominator is 8. That tells me break this up into 8 pieces. So I'll go ahead and do that. There's 4. And there is, let me just double check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yep, we're good. All right, so the denominator tells me how to break up the whole. Then it asks, what number tells you how many equal parts are described? Well, if the denominator tells me how many pieces to break up the whole into, the numerator tells me how many equal parts are described. The way I think of that is how many parts are described or shaded. So if I'm talking about 5/8, that means I would shade 5 of these 8 pieces. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. That's how many pieces of this whole are being described. Now, if we take a look, it also says how many 1/8 parts are there in 5/8. Well, remember, each of these is 1/8. Each shaded part is 1/8. But this whole part is 5/8. So how many 1/8 parts do you see shaded? Well, I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So there are 5 1/8 pieces, which means I can do 5 times 1/8, and that would also give me 5/8. These two sentences represent the same amount, but with multiplication, we can shorten it. We can write it as just 2 numbers instead of all these numbers here. So let's go ahead and practice this a little bit. I'm going to flip to my next page, and I'm actually going to take a look at the top, because this is a really important part too. Not only can multiplication help us with fractions that are smaller than one whole, but they can also help us with fractions that are bigger than one whole. So it says describe 5/4 as a multiple of a unit fraction. So how can I split up 5/4 into unit fractions? Well, if I split it up into 1/4, remember our unit fraction always has a numerator of 1. Always a numerator of 1. So I could write it as 1/4 added 5 times, or I could write it as 5 times 1/4. Because remember, the whole number is only going to be multiplied by the numerator. The denominator is going to stay the same. All right, let's go ahead and give this a shot. I'm going to move on down here. I'm going to take a look at these ones. I'm going to do these with you guys, and then I'm going to have you try a few on your own. So I'm going to put in a number into, we're going to do this for 3 and 4, a number that makes this true. So I have 2/3, and then it's saying what number times 1/3 would give me 2/3. Well, that would have to be 2, because I would do 2 times 1, and then the denominator stays the same. Let's try number 4. What would I have to put in here in order to make this true? 5 times 1 over what number gives me 5/6. Think for a moment. That would have to be 6. There's my unit fraction, 1/6. So 5 times 1/6 gives me 5/6. Let's try this one down here. Now this one we have to come up with both pieces ourselves. 4/2. Okay. Well, the unit fraction for halves would have to be 1/2. Because remember, the denominator is going to be the same for the unit fraction, but the numerator has to be 1. So in order to get to 4/2, what would I have to multiply by? Well, it would have to be 4. Because I would do 4 times 1, that would be 4 over 2. 4/2. So that one makes sense. Well, let's try number 6. 6/5. Well, let's think. What would the unit fraction be for 6/5? Well, the denominator would be the same. It would be 5, but the numerator has to be 1. So what times 1/5 would give us 6/5? Well, it would have to be 6. Because I would do 6 times 1, that's 6. And then the denominator stays the same. Okay? So whenever you're trying to identify your unit fraction, actually, let me write this down here. You guys don't have this blank space. If you have space off in the margin, you can write it there. The only reason I have unit fraction. The only reason I have this much space is because I'm working off of a piece of paper, not my book. I have to go get my book from school. All right, so unit fraction. The numerator always equals 1. And the denominator stays the same. So in case you're having trouble figuring out what is my unit fraction, this can help you. Numerator is always 1. Always, always, always. Let me write that in. Always. Always 1. And the denominator will be the same. So when we did number 6, for example, the denominator stayed the same, 6/5, and 5ths, I have the denominator the same as 5, and my numerator is always 1. Okay? So what I'm going to have you guys do now, hang on, let me flip my paper here. Oh, not that one. Where'd it go? Hang on. I have my papers out of order. Here we go. That's the one I want. All right, I'm going to have you try, this should be the bottom of that page. All right, try 7 to 18. All right, give those a shot. 7 through 12, they just have you filling in the one number. And then 13 through 18, you have to write the entire multiplication sentence yourself. So you're going to work on those. And you're also going to work on the next page, which should look something like this. All right, so there's 19, 20, 21, 22, and then 23 through 26. Okay? If you get stuck on any of them, let me know. I can always, make a video explaining how to do it and then post it up for you guys to see.